you, guys. I will start my presentation more like a comedy stand-up show. I'll address myself to my colleague Grigory Kazakov and ask him to lock my bicycle because it is standing parked just near your bicycle. This morning we headed very early at the gathering, but it started pouring. I had no raincoat, so I chose to call a taxi. Taxi never showed up, so I hurried myself here as a real professor on the bike to just reach in time to my presentation. So far for the fun. So, one of the most important tasks of studying polyglots, as you all know, is to apply the acquired knowledge to the process of language learning. And this is actually the goal of my two books. Two of them are called Linguistic and Psychological Strategies of Polyglots. The first one is How to Find Your Path to Foreign Languages, and the second one is Speaking, Reading, Writing. Also, Psychological and Linguistical Strategies of Polyglots. Having observed polyglots for over 20 years now, I experienced that there is no single set of abilities that makes a person a polyglot. There are polyglots visuals, that is, those who build their success in learning foreign languages by maximizing the resource of visual memory. For example, Heinrich Schliemann. There are polyglots audials, whose main strength is to rely on auditory memory and imitative skills. For example, Arminius Vambery. There are polyglots logicians, those who easily track the systematic and structured patterns within a new language, as well as deviations and differences from the patterns in their previous languages. For example, Sergei Khalipov, Russian polyglot. Among polyglots, we can find extroverts and introverts. But in any case, a common approach in all of the surveyed polyglots is their proactive attitude. They are not waiting for others to teach them. They all have a distinctive feeling that I am responsible for my success in learning a foreign language. While using their most developed abilities, each of the polyglots consciously develops and builds up his less prominent abilities, thus creating a harmonious whole, the necessary balance of the cognitive resources of the left and the right hemisphere in the process of learning a foreign language. It is this approach to the study of foreign languages that I call personality-focused training in second language acquisition, and that I apply in my seminars and in my books. In this report, I will focus on individual strategies for memorizing the vocabulary of a target language. Here, as in other areas, polyglots' approaches are very diverse. For example, Samvel Garibyan, a well-known Russian polyglot of Armenian background, consistently uses the method of rebus, riddle associations, and even publishes associative meaning dictionaries to be used in studying various languages. The Canadian polyglot Paul Janulus developed his own version of this method, calling it "Oh, so." That means the abbreviation AHSO. For him, the mnemonic image of a foreign word to be remembered must contain A, actions. It should be a moving picture, a kind of small inner cartoon. H, hyperbolization. Exaggeration can be expressed by a variety of means, in increasing the size, changing the proportions, using especially bright color, enlarging a single object so that it fills the entire field of view. S, substitution. That means replacement. This is a fundamentally important point. The audio image of a new word in a foreign language is replaced by more or less similar sounds of the already well-known words, frequently words of the mother tongue, while a catch for memory is the visualization of their meanings. Often these words are contributed and combined in some funny or absurd situations, a kind of rebus, recreating the sound of a foreign word. And O, be outrageous. Maybe you have noticed that provocation and violation of every norm possible makes it different and excessively stupid. Ridiculous, sexually colored association is remembered much better than the neutral one. The Ukrainian polyglot Valery Kurinsky, in his book Autodidactics, describes a similar mnemonic process as association up to a smile. Nevertheless, many other polyglots, like the prominent polyglot Alexander Arguelles, you know everyone of, for example, claim that they do not use mnemonic techniques when memorizing words, with the exception of etymological links. Alexander tends to memorize phrases and patterns from contexts in parallel texts. For him, the combination of sound, meaning, and graphics, superimposed on intensive multiple articulation with acceleration and rhythmic walking, are sufficient for memorization. But monitoring him for over 100 days, I was so lucky, guys, to get his permission, and I used it. While he was learning Hebrew, I often observed him using sensory input. For example, if he had to remain seated and learn new vocabulary not from parallel texts, but from word list preceding texts in some other textbooks, he used the sense input. Functional and iconic gestures were then unconsciously used as memorizing aids. Here are some examples. I had to learn some of Hebrew because of him. So when he learns the word al-yad, palms moves sideways on the table to the sides. And guess what? It means next to, nearby. Functional gestures for memorizing verbs. For example, Omer, Omeret, male, female, when his fingers move from the mouth forward, actually his left finger because he's left-handed. Or complex metonymic gestures for abstract nouns. I liked teavon. Very satisfied expression, palm on the stomach, appetite. And there are multiple of such examples on the Polyglot Gathering in Moscow this August. I especially devoted my whole report on analyzing types of gestures that were used by Alexander Arguelles while learning Hebrew that I monitored in this process. Once in an interview, I was asked to name the most effective way to memorize foreign words, to which I replied that after comparing hundreds of people in order to identify effective strategies for memorizing foreign words, I found no one perfect or universal recipe. Each person can and should consider which way is the easiest and most effective to remember the foreign words. And then I'd added, but I can name the most inefficient way to learn foreign words from a dictionary. I knew several particularly zealous students of philology who started learning a new language by picking up the thickest dictionary they could, opening it on letter A, and setting themselves a task of learning as many words as they could in hope to know the whole dictionary by heart soon. But I do not know of anyone who would move this way further than the letter B. I reminded the journalist that mechanical memorization without real context and the principal word is equal to its translation contradict the ecology of the human mind, where every new impression, including a verbal one, should be linked with the diverse previous experiences. Only then will the sense of a word be truly mastered by brain. But once during a family dinner, we were discussing a similar topic. Suddenly, my mother, a professor in Germanic studies, said, "Don't you remember Carl Friedlein, the compiler of the Russian-German dictionaries? He often stayed with us when you were little. He is also a polyglot, learned 13 languages lying on the couch and reading dictionaries." In truth, as the English proverb goes, never say never. And yet, I believe that Carl Friedlein memorized words and word usage by reading dictionaries differently than philology students trying to memorize long lists of letter A words. Being an experienced professional lexicographer, he not so much memorized as conceptualized the words and related them to similar word entries in other dictionaries and other languages. The study of polyglots allowed me to identify specific behavioral strategies associated with the 4 stages of mastering the linguistic material. Those 4 stages are: step 1, loading, primary input of language information. Step 2, intake, fixing new information in memory, that means saving. 3, retrieval, access to previously learned language information. And finally, 4, internalization, transforming the acquired language information into their automatic skill. In this report, I will focus my attention only on stages 1 and 2, while the stages 3 and 4 associated with a resourceful repetition mode can be brilliantly demonstrated by the strategy of organizing language classes by Alexander Arguelles, who briefly described it in his formula. It's a great formula. 15 minutes a day, every single day, over a period of 4 or 5 years, cyclically shadowing a bilingual text to the point of internalization. The shortest formulation of his strategy, which he gives in his published article. The experiment that I regularly conducted for 15 years with the participants of my personality-focused training in second language acquisition was devoted to studying the resourceful behavior of language learners in the first 2 stages, loading and saving. The goal of the exercise was to enable the participants to identify their own most effective memorization strategies. I was trying to convince them that there was no one most effective way of internalizing the vocabulary of the language, and that in order to achieve optimal results, one should make the most of his perceptive strengths, while nurturing those perceptual qualities that are underdeveloped. We have always paid for our mostly developed qualities, but some that are not so well developed. We can call them for perceptive weaknesses. So, stage 1, stage of initial input of new information. Research and comparison of polyglot behavioral strategies at the stage of initial input of new language information revealed one key requirement: confidence in the accuracy of the information input. You must learn only what you are 100% sure of. This translates into a whole range of behavioral techniques: memorizing the visual image of a word or phrase, pronouncing aloud, tracking articulation and stress, pronouncing with an acceleration to the point where the utterance becomes absolutely comfortable and confident. For example, Sergei Khalipov did not begin to use the new word in a phrase until he was completely sure of his correct pronunciation. And even if his African informants nodded approvingly, he asked them again and again to correct him if he felt that articulation of the word was causing him difficulty. He achieved natural articulation by deliberately speeding up the pronunciation in a tongue twister mode, and his finger movements guided him. And then he returned to the normal speed of fluent speech and felt quite confident. Observing Alexander Arguez, I noticed that one of the speakers, a woman, caused his strong disapproval. Because speaking Hebrew, she dialectically dropped the initial sound h, which for him distorted the sound form of the word and hindered memorization. Alexander also achieved sound authenticity by speech acceleration, as Khalipov did. But he used a computer program, Audacity, to accelerate the speech so that he had to repeat the text with a similarly accelerated speed. Such observations over polyglots prompted me to create an exercise in which each of the participants could analyze the peculiarities of their behavior at the stage of loading a new lexical material. Russian-speaking participants in the training were asked to choose a dozen words from the proposed lexical lists of appropriative difficulty, including concrete and abstract nouns, verbs, and adjectives. This is an example of such checklist, which in one or another way they had to memorize right on the spot. I asked them to name the selected word first in Russian, and at the same time to see how the word is spelled in English. Then I pronounced the word in English and gave contextual examples. That is what I always do. Then I asked the student to pronounce this word out loud. This is a key moment of this step. Nothing could be simpler, but observing all participants, I have always been amazed how differently people cope with this stage, and as the subsequent test shows, how this stage affects the long-term memory. Some, instead of first pronouncing the selected words in Russian, immediately say them in English. If a person's level allows him to do it without mistakes in pronunciation, then everything is fine. But quite often, the first pronunciation of the word is stumbling and erroneous. Of course, I correct the error and ask to repeat the word several times correctly. But what happens next? Guess, try to guess. When we check learned words in a circle, what happens? Here it turns out that no matter how a person memorizes his words, the very word in which he made a mistake at the first loading stage is the most difficult to remember and pronounce correctly. Having watched one person, you might think that this is a coincidence. But when the same thing happens with almost everyone who hesitated at the loading stage, the group begins to understand how fundamentally important for the lasting memory of language material is this short and seemingly insignificant moment. Jokingly, I call this moment of the first pronunciation of a word sacred. As many polyglots intuitively feel, this moment determines how easy or how difficult it will be to recall the word and how fast it will find way into an active vocabulary. It also happens sometimes that a person at the first presentation pronounces a word correctly, but in a hesitant tone or near a whisper. Surprisingly, the hesitation and uncertainty will stick in memory better than the word itself, as if becoming an integral part of the meaning of the new word. Interestingly, early in the training, many people complain about the difficulties in recalling their already learned material. They talk of the runaway words that they seem to have learned but cannot remember at the right time. That is a typical case of inefficient loading of new lexical information. In the exercise described, there are the people who are careless at the loading stage of learning language information. During this exercise, it is very important not only to explain, but also to let people really experience firsthand that the feeling of uncertainty in pronunciation, spelling, meaning, when loading new language material, becomes an integral part of this language material. By the way, that is why every efficient language learning method speaks about friendly atmosphere in the group, acceptance of everyone, because that creates that emotional background that is extremely important. If in a class we are worried, if we are suppressed by the teacher, if we are afraid, all those negative emotions stick together with a word. The word will never want to be memorized and recalled in that dangerous situation. And subconscious uncertainty becomes associated with a word of expression as if obscuring it. Awareness of their own behavior at the time of loading new language information allows people to develop more effective input strategies, namely to consciously train themselves to articulate new words loudly, clearly, confidently, and fairly fluently. This also helps to memorize properly the meaning and the spelling. So we go over to stage 2, fixing new information in memory. What does our brain actually do? Somehow to press the save button and transfer the new information to the first short-term and then long-term memory. Before embarking on this exercise, all participants in the seminar are told about the above memorizing strategies. However, when checking, I come across some really exotic ways of remembering that worked for one particular person only. For example, at different times, I met people who perfectly memorized lists of words they chose. Asked how they achieved it, they would shrug their shoulders and say, "This is the word starting with D. This is the word with the letter S. The audience was bewildered. Nobody could repeat the same feat. But for those individuals, the strategy worked. What abilities are activated by this unusual method? There are two possible answers. The first possibility is that the person has a strong visual memory and simply photographs a graphic image of the word. In this case, the person would confess to frequently experiencing runaway words, that is, words that he remembers having heard but is unable to recall when he needs them. The word easily remembered visually is usually divorced from the meaning and escapes us when we need it the most. However, I once met a person with such a strategy who claimed that memorization of words was never a problem for him. I rechecked and understood that he was telling truth. Only later did I understand the true reason behind this case. At another seminar, a woman named Ekaterina said that she could easily remember words in foreign languages, but in a completely different way. Her results stunned other participants and made me remember the previous case with alphabetical memory. I will briefly reproduce our conversation at that time. I called out random Russian words from her list, and she confidently responded. Отчаяние. Ekaterina. Black. Despondency. Покаяние. Repentance. It looks like in French. Препятствие. Brown like a horse over a barrel. Hurdle. Провал. Ekaterina moving involuntarily her palms down. Flop. I don't know how. Just remembered. Ветхий. Black. Decrepit. Кишащий. Violet. Moves. Teeming. Зловещий. Ominous. Green. With a glitter. Толпиться. Dance blue movement to swarm. Разрастаться. Multicolored to sprout. Стереть. Obliterate. Chocolate brown. The most unusual in Ekaterina's strategy is the strong experience, expressive association between meaning and color. Her sense of the word meaning, which is the same regardless of language, is strongly associated with color. And so is the pronunciation. Therefore, once learned, the word is never forgotten. It makes sense. The word and the feeling of its meaning are inseparable in any language whatsoever. It is quite possible that the participant with the alphabetic memory also intuitively learned to build individual sensory and therefore not articulated in words associations between the sound of the word and its meaning. But unfortunately, I could not get from him additional clarifying information sufficient to make a more confident assumption. Back to Ekaterina. When asked how she did not confuse the black color of despair, despondency, and the black color of decay, decrepit, she exclaimed, but these are completely different shades. Try to imagine it, and you will agree that she is right. And note that in addition to color coding of meanings, there was also a clear sensory input. Remember, flop, I don't know how I remembered, it just remembered. In fact, the word was remembered by her body. The meaning was activated by the movement of her hands. Ekaterina's strategy displays auditory clues as well. For example, her association, the obstacle is brown, like a horse over a barrier, hurdle, is unconsciously linked not only to the brown shade of a horse, which Ekaterina could have imagined at that moment, but also to the sound analogy between hurdle and horse. You can see inter-language semantic associations are used too, as in the case of the Anglo-French analogies in the example of repentance. In Ekaterina's case, the recall was perfect, and this confirms how important it is not only to find the individual way to memorize words, but also to be flexible. Not to stick to one strategy, but to let words enter your inner world and connect with your personal experience in the easiest way for your brain. All personal abilities for multisensory information input must be encouraged. I like watching the participants memorizing words by making funny rebus associations between the meaning of the word and its English sound. But I soon noticed that people tend to memorize short words of negative semantics without building visual or auditory puzzles. For example, such words as hate, fear, shame are easily remembered without any association. An average participant would just say, I don't know, I just remember, no associations, short probably. Indeed, the shorter the word, the easier it is to remember. But these same people gladly memorize the short word zeal by comparing it with the famous Russian brand of cars or refrigerators, Zeal, that zealously tries to survive in the modern capitalist economy. Remember, associations stick in memory only if they are related to our own experiences. That is, brevity is not the only factor that helps our brain to easily remember words. The above words, hate, fear, shame, cause strong negative emotions, and the body learns what it means to experience hatred, fear, or shame. I intentionally speak of the body, not of the brain, because all these emotions are directly related to different kinesthetic factors, levels of adrenaline in the blood, muscle tone, depth and the rhythm of breath, and so on. And besides, our brain is ecological. It is easier for our brain to simply remember one more way of naming a familiar negative emotion, now in a foreign language, instead of playing with it in a sketch. But I repeat, people are very different, and someone having tested a strong kinesthetic strategy for memorizing words when sensory link to the meaning is activated by the obligatory pronouncing aloud a new language material understands that it works and turns it into the leading memorizing strategy. For such people, a breakthrough after the seminar comes when they start working with interesting English films or American films, pronouncing dialogues after their favorite characters, paying special attention to episodes which correspond to their mood. And soon they start to speak fluently and idiomatically. For others, completely different strategies of memorizing new vocabulary seem natural. What follows is my attempt to systematize my experience in working with people of different perceptive types and to list advantages and disadvantages of different types. So let's start with determining the intake type. What type of language learners you belong to? Kinesthetic type does not have to make an effort to memorize sensory or emotional words, as shame, agility, to sprout. It is people of kinesthetic type who most often say, I don't know how I memorized, I just remembered it. But without noticing, they accompany the loading of a foreign word with small hand movements. For example, to defy, with a sharp movement as if the person was throwing a glove, or hurdle with an elastic movement of both palms forward as if the person was pushing against the invisible wall. If you are auditory, the auditory type enjoys memorizing words by the principle of sound rebus. But if he gives an incomplete sound analogy, he will remember it that way. Associates a word not by spelling but by sound. Often fascinated by looking for sound analogies, can forget about the meaning of the word. Playing with the sound without paying attention to the meaning turns the word for him into a runaway. I know that I once heard the word, but I cannot remember what it means. And visual. People with a strong visual memory, remembering a word, yes, and I want to underline that speaking about visual type, I mean people with a strong visual memory. My observations show that the ability to build up strong visual constructs, fantasies, does not always imply a strong visual memory. A person with a strong visual memory remembering a word often says, I wrote it and I learned it, or I just see the word on the page. If a person with a strong visual memory builds rebuses, he creates them following not a sound, but a graphic image. For example, the word like knowledge, the visual type invariably associates with the verb to know, if he knows that at the beginner stage. And if he's at the initial stage of learning English, then with the Russian word kniga, book, adding that kniga is a source of knowledge. Kniga – источник знаний. Kniga – source of knowledge. So KN is what he hooks his memory to. Whereas a typical auditory type will instead involuntarily have an association. У меня 0 знаний. I have a 0, 0 in Russian, knowledge. Because for him, the most important thing is that knowledge sounds like 0. And it's so funny to observe the reactions of people of different perceptual types sitting in one circle. Very often, the other people's strategies of memorizing irritate those who don't have them. They think that they are stupid, that they are inefficient. But no, we are different, and different strategies are efficient for each of us. The way to find your path to foreign language is to know yourself. Nostete ipsum, and you will find the key to that fascinating process. We continue. So now I want to discuss pluses and minuses. I have 3 minutes and it will do. Pluses of kinesthetic type is once having memorized, he easily recalls the word. Usually there are no problems with retrieving vocabulary, since sensing the meaning is a common denominator for both mother tongue and the foreign language. But minus, if he learns without speaking out loud, then difficulties may arise with pronunciation less often, and with speech understanding very often. More difficult is the memorization of abstract words. Auditory type easily catches pronunciation, easily recognizes new words in speech and understands by ear, builds sound associations easily, and quickly gets fluent in a foreign language. Minuses often has problems with literacy, may have difficulty remembering meaning of a word. For example, this word begins with st, or fission, fission, fission. I recognize the sound of this word, I have learned it, but I cannot remember what it means. But if instead he makes a little rhyme, fission is division, or fission is not fusion, so he remembers it. And visual type easily remembers written words, is very good at spelling, easily recognizes a familiar word in a book. But if the word was not memorized properly, can have difficulties in recalling its meaning, has problems with pronunciation. It is more difficult for him to understand by ear. Even with a large vocabulary, it is difficult for him to start speaking. But great plus. When he overcomes the threshold level, he begins to speak correctly and idiomatically, and easily improves his knowledge at more advanced levels. And the last thing, ways to improve the strategy. Kinesthetic. I recommend to speak out loudly the memorized word, carefully tracking articulation. Taste the word in the mouth, as Sergei Khalipov said. For long words of abstract semantics, build funny, strange, playful rebuses, allowing you to revitalize the meaning of the word and associate its meaning with the sound. For an easy listening comprehension, it's very important to hear this word in a vivid conversation and preferably in several different emotional contexts. It is important to write down the word by hand. Auditory. Build sound rebuses in a more accurate way, looking for analogies for all syllables. For example, in case of association for desire as dezertir zаяц, a deserter hare that has nothing to do with meaning, include the meaning of the word into the auditory rebus. Desire, it's not just a deserter hare, but a hare who desperately longs to desert from the army. Notice that this very association occurred to my young participant who was in that age when in Russia people are of conscription age. So he desperately desired to desert from the army. That is why this association occurred to him. Spell a word, especially its potentially difficult to write part. augment. Highlight the complex part of the internal visual presentation of the word with pulsating color. And visual. At the stage of loading a new word while writing it down, it is necessary to pronounce it out loud. To improve listening skills, learn to deliberately speed up spoken phrases in order to get used to all the acoustic changes in quick speech, which distinguishes it from the written version. And while memorizing, revive the meaning of the word. I'm brief, but I want only to conclude that I gave examples focusing on special strategies, but it is very efficient to, while fixing new information, to combine the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic input. And in that way, you will achieve the complete understanding, feeling, sensation of the world, and it will become part of your inner self. Thus, modeling polyglots for the diversity of learners helps us to elicit some powerful input strategies and apply them to personality-focused language training. Thank you.
I think you said that you were monitoring Alexander Arguelles for 100 days. Did he always know you were there monitoring him, or was it sometimes like a surprise type of thing?
No, definitely not. I was blessed with him offering me that exceptional opportunity. He wanted a linguist to observe him in a process of language learning. It was not directly online because there is no time difference between Dubai and Moscow. And he started his classes at 4 a.m. and I'm a late sleeper, so it was no way that I could observe him online. But what I did, he gave me links to each session, and when I woke up, I looked through the whole session and wrote down my questions, and I sent a mail to him with all those questions, and he was so kind to answer each of my questions. I have lots of most valuable materials that I keep publishing some tiny bits of, but there are much, much more than I have published so far. So he was completely aware of what I was doing. Thank you.
I've seen on the beginning of your lecture, you showed 2 books. Do you maybe have them here so we can maybe see them or buy them even?
Unfortunately, I didn't bring them with me. I have a weight restriction for 8 kilos, and I like to have several dresses for several days, so it's my weakness, excuse me. But if you just Google Dina Nikulicheva, the books will pop up and you will find them online. They are online. So this is the first book published in 2009, and it was reprinted 10 times already, and it is the second book from 2013, and it was also reprinted. Yes.
Thank you. Can I call question? My question is that what do you think of a method that I use in order to memorize new words in other languages? For example, in Hungarian we have some words that are not familiar. For example, ut level, I can remember it with words that I know in English, like Utah and level. And we can say in Hungarian pens mean like pension in English. I always associate words with something that I know in my mother tongue, also in English language, in order to memorize them. Like karova in Russian mean car over in English. That's why I can memorize these words that are not in my language to increase the vocabulary and memory. What do you think about this method?
I will try to repeat your question as I understood it, and please correct me if I didn't understand it correctly. But did you ask about some new languages where you cannot find the associations with those tongues you previously know, or those associations in that very new language? What was the question about it? I didn't quite...
The question was about, I suggest my method. Do you think it is useful that in these languages, everything, I can find a word that is associated to other things that I know in every language, like international language. To associate some different word that it is not international word in some language to something that I know.
Oh, you ask about so-called transparent words. Yes, this is what another polyglot, what I didn't mention, Dmitry Petrov. He was very popular in Russian. He created his very popular TV course based on his polyglot strategies of learning new languages. And he says, just think about the great present that every language gives us, the transparent words. For example, collaborazione, rivoluzione, and other Italian words with zione as shun in English. So you know already almost 5,000 words without learning them, he says. Just don't bother learning them. They are already there. What I meant was not the words that can be found in different languages. I meant building rebuses, so dividing words in small bits that remind you of something, if you like this strategy. Because usually I know that people of auditory type like this strategy, and I guess that you don't belong to the auditory type. So maybe this is not the way for you to, maybe the way to sense the word, to repeat it many times, to use it at least 3, better 7 times in differently emotionally loaded contexts. Try the word on yourself. Use the word in the situations where you speak from the first person. I feel how that word comes into your internal world. Maybe that will be the way of loading Hungarian words for you.
I was really interested by the example of Ekaterina, who kind of associated colors and vocabulary, because that kind of reminded me of synesthesia, which is when you experience one, for example, you hear music and you see colors, and some people have this when they see letters or words and they associate colors with that. So have you looked into that too?
Yes, by the way, she was a talented artist too, so her sense of colors was probably much different from how we sense the colors. Every color, every shade is very meaningful for her. Yes, synesthesia is what is actually needed if you are strong visual. So increase confidently and aimfully, purposefully the kinesthetic and auditory components to create that synesthesia. If you're kinesthetic, so pay attention to auditory and visual parts of the meaning. Synesthesia is a great word. Thank you.